Hello everyone, and welcome back to World of Warships Blitz with Terry. Today we're going to be talking about guns and ammunition. We'll have a look first at our Tier 3 cruiser, the St. Louis, just as an example. And we're going to check out the main guns and take a closer look at the ammunition types and see what this all means. And then we'll get to some other ones and I'll be talking about what to use in which kind of situation. So the St. Louis has got 152mm guns at the mains, and she has two ammunition types, as do most of the ships, with certain exceptions in the game. She can fire HE, which is high explosive ammunition, and she can fire AP, which is armor-piercing ammunition. Now, an HE shell has a fuse that basically detonates on impact. So what you'll get when you fire these at enemy ships is, regardless of armor, regardless of where you hit them, you're always going to do damage. The HEs have a chance of setting fire. So when you hit them, there's in this case, a 4% chance that you'll be setting a fire to the ship that you've been hitting for each shell that you hit it with. Then the fire burns. You can set up to 3 fires per ship and does additional damage as it goes, unless the other player uses a damage control kit and extinguishes the fire. The armor-piercing shells, unlike the high explosive ones, have a fuse that activates once a certain amount of armor has been passed by the shell. Basically, what the armor-piercing shell is trying to do is it's trying to get into the enemy ship and get through the armor and explode on the inside. Obviously, the idea there being that if it's not detonating on the surface of the ship, damaging the superstructure and whatever's on deck, but gets into the inside of the ship, it'll do a lot more damage. And generally, you'll see that the armor-piercing shells do more base damage. In this case, the high explosive do 414 base damage, and the armor-piercing does 501 base damage. This is before any kind of armor or any of the other factors comes in. The armor-piercing shells have a specialty in that they can hit the citadel of a ship. Now, the citadel is kind of like an inverted bathtub on the inside of a ship where a lot of the important bits are sitting, and this is where the armor is concentrated. So if you manage to penetrate that inverted tub and get to the really important bits of the ship and have an armor-piercing shell exploding there, you're doing additional damage. For these 150mm shells, the additional damage is going to be 150%. So instead of doing 500, you do about 750 damage. Let's have a look at some different ships just to get an overview of what kind of guns they're going to be firing. So that was a Tier 3 cruiser. Let's have a look at our Sims, which is a Tier 7 American destroyer. And she's got 127mm guns, so a smaller caliber, which means she does less damage. And she does 380 high explosive and 403 armor-piercing damage. The guns you'll be mostly the type of ammunition you'll be mostly firing with a ship like this is high explosive, just because the smaller shells are more likely to bounce. So that's another thing that you have to consider when shooting at an enemy ship, is the armor on the other side. High explosive, as we said, will explode on impact, so regardless of the armor, you're going to be doing damage. Armor-piercing, on the other hand, while they have the potential to do more damage, especially with the citadel hits, they also have the possibility of bouncing off the armor. Not sure how well angling and armor in general is implemented in World of Warships Blitz. In the PC version, there's a lot of detail and science about it. In this one, from my experience, it doesn't quite matter that much. Regardless, you will see bounces, especially from lower calibers, on armored targets. So the rule of thumb generally here is that if you shoot with anything with light cruiser or destroyer guns, so destroyers being around 100 to 130 millimeters, light cruisers usually around 150 millimeters, and the heavy cruisers have around usually 200 millimeters. Let's take a look at a heavy cruiser, for example, the German Admiral Hipper at tier 8. She has got 203 millimeter main guns, and these guns will mostly penetrate with armor piercing, even if you shoot at heavily armored battleships and do damage. Anything below that has a fairly large chance of bouncing. So there's your first rule of thumb. If you're shooting at something heavily armored, like a battleship, with anything below 200 millimeter guns, so with a light cruiser or a destroyer, you're mostly better off using high explosive shells, especially at range. This is the second factor, right? So imagine a shell being shot at a ship. If you shoot at range, it'll come in on a high arc and it'll come plunging down onto the enemy ship, which means in order to get, for an armor-piercing shell to get through the citadel, it has to go through the superstructure, through the deck armor, and then make its way through the citadel. Whereas if you shoot at a close range, the shell has much higher velocity because it doesn't have its drop terminal velocity, but it actually has the muzzle velocity mostly coming out of the gun, and it has a higher chance of penetrating. So if you say you're 3 kilometers from the enemy ship, you can shoot smaller like 150 millimeter armor piercing shells at a battleship and actually get citadel penetrations if you're lucky. But if you are in a light cruiser and you're 3 kilometers from a battleship, you have different problems because they will shoot at you and make your life very, very, very short. So let's have a look at one thing you notice here is that the 203 millimeter shells have a 200% citadel damage rate. And if we look at battleship shells, for example, let's look at the German battleship Bayern. She's a tier 6 and she has 380 millimeter main guns. They do 250% damage on the citadel strike. So that's a fair old amount of damage. You would definitely use armor piercing against enemy battleships and look for those citadels. Now, talking about citadels, not all ships in the game do have citadels. Destroyers don't have them. So you cannot citadel a destroyer. And there's another thing that an armor-piercing shell can do and not do much damage, aside from bouncing, which does 0 damage, it can also over-penetrate. Again, consider that an armor-piercing shell has a fuse which needs to be activated in order for the shell to actually explode. And it needs to go through a certain amount of armor to activate. Now, if you look at a destroyer, it doesn't have any armor, or not much to speak of. So mostly what you get if you shoot large caliber armor piercing, like the 380 millimeter shells we've just seen on the Bayern, at a destroyer, is over penetrations. The shell is just going to go straight through, come out the other side, and most likely not even explode. You do, I think, round about 20% of the possible damage. So looking back at the Bayern, the possible damage with armor piercing is 1,600. So you do, I don't know, 15%, 20%. You do probably about 250 points of damage with an armor piercing shell if you shoot it right through a destroyer, which is a lot less than if you were shooting with a high explosive shell. Because again, the destroyer doesn't really have any armor, and the high explosive shell will definitely explode. So you'd probably be doing close to the possible base damage to a destroyer. Now imagine you're shooting this thing's got 8 main guns. Imagine you're shooting you're doing 8 times 900 damage. You're going to take half the life of any destroyer that you're facing, and if you've got a destroyer which is already damaged, there's a fair chance that you can one-shot them with a full salvo at close range with high explosive shells. Whereas if you shoot armor piercing, you're doing minimal damage, and the destroyer is going to torpedo you. So the choice of ammunition is very important, and it's also important to understand what the implications are of these things. Now, there's one special type of ship that I want to point out, and that's the British light cruiser range. So if we look at the tech tree, the British light cruisers, aside from the premium ships, are the only ships in the regular game that you can unlock. And even up to tier 10 in the Minotaur, you will see that they only shoot armor-piercing. They have no high explosive shells in this game. So imagine you being in a higher tier light cruiser with 152mm guns, and you're shooting armor-piercing at a battleship at range. Most of these shells are just going to bounce, and the rest that are actually going to hit aren't going to do much damage, but you don't have a choice. You can't set them on fire using high explosive shells as you would do in any other cruiser. So in this case, the British light cruiser tech tree is a really big pain to grind through, because up to tier 9 with the Neptune, you're going to have a hell of a time. Right, so if we look at the tier 6, for example, the Leander, she has 850mm guns. You have no high explosive, and she has 8 torpedoes. So launchers on each side. So you only have 4 torpedoes to shoot from one side at a battleship. The torpedoes have a decent range with 6 kilometers, but you basically can't do much damage with a 7.5 second reload and only 4 torpedoes on a side to a battleship. You'll be sitting right next to it in torpedo range, unloading your armor-piercing and not doing all that much damage. So grinding through this tech tree, and I can tell you because I did it, grinding through this tech tree, especially starting with the Leander, the Fiji, and then the Edinburgh, is an absolute nightmare, because every single time you encounter battleships, they shoot armor-piercing at you. You're in a light cruiser. You have a citadel. They're not just going to over-penetrate. You will get citadel hits, and they do massive amount of damage, unlike against destroyers. Until you reach tier 9, the Neptune, this is where things get fun. And she still has 150mm guns, but look at the reload. My Neptune's got a reload time of 5.5 seconds, and she's got 12 guns. So even though I can't shoot high explosive with this thing, the armor-piercing does a decent amount of base damage, and even if half my shells are bouncing off an enemy battleship, with the rate of fire I can put out of this thing from a distance, at 11.45 kilometers, eventually I whittle them down, plus she's got 4 quadruple launchers of torpedoes with a 7.8 kilometer range, which is comparable to the Japanese torpedoes, even though they're just 530mm, not the 600mm, and they do somewhat less damage, but you can do massive amounts of torpedo damage with this ship. You've got a smoke screen, and you can shell out armor-piercing shells like there's no tomorrow, and this thing absolutely shreds destroyers, because this is one of the only ships that's actually a light cruiser at higher tiers. If you look at the German ships, you get the light cruisers up to tier 6 with the Nürnberg, but starting at tier 7, the York is going to have 210mm actually main guns, which still means she can do a good amount of damage against destroyers, but they don't have the same firing rate, right? They reload. They take 11 seconds to reload, whereas the Nürnberg, with her 150mm guns, is much more rapid firing and only takes 7.5 seconds to reload with my build. So having a light cruiser at higher tiers is an absolute nightmare for destroyers. That's where the British light cruisers come in and do a really great job. Now, if you look back at the guns, say, on the Sims where we were earlier, you would think, look at the amount of damage they do, right? They're 127mm, they do 380 high explosive damage. There's only 4 of them. You're in a destroyer, you're most likely going to use your torpedoes. And that's not quite right. I do probably half the amount of damage I do in my Sims, I just do with the guns, just by using the high explosive shells. And they've got a fire rate of 3.6 seconds. So you're going to be using an amazing amount of fire on enemy ships, and you can do a large amount of damage with fire this way. So don't forget, even on small destroyers with high explosive, not armor-piercing, you can do a decent amount of damage by setting fires to other ships. So let's try this out with my tier 6 Nürnberg class light cruiser. It's one of my favorite ships. And we have a quick look at the guns. She's got 150mm main guns, 9 of them. That is typical with the German light cruisers, or just the German ships in general, they have much better armor-piercing damage than high explosive damage. So she's doing 400 base damage for high explosive and 644 for armor-piercing. This is with full upgrades. Let's take her into a co-op battle because we're just going to do some research and try out the different ammo types and see how this works against different types of ships. So here we've got some enemy destroyers to shoot at, and we're using the armor-piercing. Remember, 644 base damage. And we do, some of them get full armor-piercing damage, some of them get over-penetrations. Yeah, we don't really care about the torpedoes here, but basically in 3 salvos you can destroy the ship. You see some of them doing only 50% damage. Let's switch over to the high explosive and see how that would do against the destroyer, because we've got one here right now. You see we're doing relatively reliable damage, but we're only doing about 385 instead of the 640 we can do with the armor-piercing. In return, we can actually set them on fire, and the fire will cause some additional damage. So it's a matter of it's a matter of choice really, but against a destroyer with 150mm guns, I would definitely go with the armor-piercing. He would have been dead by now if we had used armor-piercing. There's a Fuso, so let's try out the armor-piercing against the Fuso, which is a battleship. We're at relatively close range with 4 kilometers, so we might be able to do some damage to him. We'll aim a bit higher into the superstructure, and you see most of the shells just bounce or do only 200 damage, which is due to the armor of the Fuso. So let's see if we can get anything else done. We got a couple of penetrations, but not much. Again, we mostly got bounces or minimal damage on this. So let's switch over to the high explosive and see how that does. Fuso is already on fire in 3 places, so we can't set any more fires. And we look at this. All shells do damage. They do about between 175 and 350 damage. I suspect the ones that do full damage are high explosive penetrations, whereas the other ones are just exploding on the surface. But the difference being, again, we can set enemy ships on fire. There's a Furutaka. She's a Japanese cruiser, and she doesn't have the same amount of armor as a battleship does. So we switch back to the armor-piercing. Again, with relatively close range with 6 kilometers. And once she actually starts wiggling left and right, we can get some shots into her. Now we're even closer at 4 kilometers. Aiming down at the waterline, and we get relatively good armor-piercing damage done. And there we got a citadel hit. So we managed to penetrate the citadel armor and do double damage, or whatever the bonus for the citadels is. So again, against another light cruiser, in this case the Furutaka is a heavy cruiser, but that doesn't mean she's got heavy armor, it just means she's got bigger guns. You can totally shoot armor-piercing even with 150mm guns. Smaller than that, maybe at close range, but I wouldn't really do it. Again, the fire damage here again might be more beneficial. And we've got her. Now, for comparison, we'll take a battleship into battle. The Tier 6 German battleship, the Bayern. Let's have a look at her guns. The main battery consists of 8 380mm guns, and they do 1,600 armor-piercing damage. And again, German ships, they do relatively low high explosive damage, only 897. So let's again take her into a co-op battle to do some research. You'll notice that one particularity with German battleships is that the secondaries only shoot armor-piercing. This is good and bad. Normally secondaries only shoot high explosive for other nations. It's good in that German battleships have very good secondaries. It's bad in that if you use them against another battleship, these are relatively low caliber. They're about 150mm probably. They will not do much with armor piercing, as we've just seen when we were using the Nürnberg's 150mm against the Fuso. The main guns can use both armor piercing and high explosive, but I tend to stick with the armor piercing. unless I really have a clear shot at a destroyer. So let's see if we can hit something. There's an Alba. This is your primary target with armor piercing. Shots out. And we've done 2 hits with full damage and 1 hit only with 300 damage. That was an over-penetration. And we see the secondaries against the destroyer. That's where the secondaries actually come in really nicely, because they do relatively high damage. Yo, I was shooting at that for research. Let's keep targeting the Alba with the main guns with the armor piercing. And again, we're doing relatively high damage. There's an enemy battleship. There's a Fuso. So let's see if we can get the main guns trained on her and see what that does. The battleships have more armor. So we're not going to do 1600 damage. We're doing about 1400, but we do get citadels even from this distance. And here come the secondaries against the battleship. These 150 millimeters armor piercing mostly just bounce off. This is one problem you're going to have with German battleships, that the secondaries are not really useful against, not really that useful against other battleships. Yeah, and again, somebody takes our target away. There's a New Mexico. It's an American battleship. It's a bit more strongly armored than the Fuso. So we only do about 700 damage with the armor piercing and penetrations. We do a little bit of damage with the secondary armor piercing. Let's see if we can get any more citadels in. And there you've seen the auto. There it goes with citadels. There we've seen the automatic secondaries firing up. These are high explosive shells, so they can set their own fire. I do tend to aim a little bit higher for the citadels against battleships, kind of where the superstructure is, because the shells do end up landing a bit lower, just from the firing arc. And she's out of range of our automatic secondaries. Then the last ship we've got, well, not anymore, was a carrier. Carriers have citadels, so you can shoot armor piercing at these things and you will do massive damage. Usually the problem is that the carrier stays behind and you actually have to find them. And lastly, we'll go out with our Sims class destroyer. We've talked about her earlier. She's got 127 millimeter guns, 4 of them, and she's got very good high explosive damage, and she's got a very good fire rate. So let's again do a research battle against bots and see what we can do with her guns. We're not going to be firing torpedoes, just to find out what the guns are capable of really in this ship. And there we've got an enemy battleship. It's in gun range, so we're popping smoke and starting to fire the high explosives. And as you can see, the reload is really quick. They don't do much damage, but that's not what we're after. We're trying to set her on fire in multiple places ideally and let the fire do the damage. And with the rate of fire that we're getting out, we do have penetrating hits in the superstructure. It's plunging fire. She's got a really high arc. And there we go, we've set a fire. So you notice the fire is burning amidships. We can still set more fires in the front and in the rear. So you got to adjust your aim a little bit. And of course, if you're this close to a battleship, there we go with the second fire, you don't really want to be standing still. And this is where the turret rotation comes in. The Sims has an insanely good turret rotation speed, so even when going roundabout, back and forth, and weaving and bobbing, she can get all her turrets trained on the ship relatively quickly. And this damage just adds up, right? It's small caliber damage, but it's a lot of it. You fire high explosives, so you always get damage, even if it's just 162, and you keep setting fires on enemy ships. Of course, against the battleship in a real battle, you would be using your torpedoes. But if you're not currently busy firing your torpedoes, or if they're on reload, then by all means, use your guns. And even if you're in a Japanese destroyer and you have no reason to hide, you're spotted anyway, use your main guns. You can do a significant amount of damage. And there we go, another fire set. We're just firing guns here, we're not actually using our torpedoes. There we go, second fire set. And she's burning down nicely. Let's see if we can get a fire set at the front. There we got another fire set. And we're just continuously firing these high explosive shells at her. Of course, two can play this game. If you're in a battleship and you're fighting a destroyer, you can set fires with your high explosives as well, because they do have very good chance of setting fire. And there's the first battleship. We've sunk her purely with our main guns in a destroyer, setting fires on it. And yeah, I just wanted to show you the battle results screen. We've done 36,000 damage with our main batteries and another 31,000 with fires. We've set 7 fires. We've had over 200 main battery hits with this little destroyer. Of course, against bots, against real players, this is going to look a little different, but you can set, just due to the fire rate, you can do a significant amount of damage with your high explosives, and you can set fires which do an additional amount of damage, which adds up over time, just simply due to the rate of fire that these little guns put out. So yeah, there we have it. A bit of an overview about guns and ammo types. So just try it out for yourself, see how it goes, and try to use high explosive against with smaller guns against heavily armored ships. Try to get the right ammo type for the right situation. It can make all the difference in a battle. All right, that's it for today. I'll see you next time.